you open up with your opening question about your personal why, do you see a resonance with the students?
Well, I think students, by and large, are looking for some new answers to some thorny questions, and the Cradle to Cradle book is a seminal text really for offering a world of abundance as opposed to the reductionist approach that we've had previously. So I do think that they come ready and eager to learn. But I think I'd extend that into the broader environment and looking into commercial environments too. And we need to encourage commerce to do the right thing. Not just to look for economies of scale, but to do the right thing.
Ken, your thoughts?
I'm tempted almost to remind ourselves, or to remind me actually, because it's quite a humbling process, that it seems that all economics is about stories of redemption. It's about, say, post-World War II, it was, we want jobs and growth, we want social democracy in various flavours, and the government was there to make sure there was enough spending in the economy. That was the simple payoff. We've fought this war, we've come through all of this, we need jobs and growth, government's there to guarantee it, it happens. In the 70s, it still says, at the end of the 70s, it's still the same story, jobs and growth, but the story flips a bit to saying, it's markets and efficiency and competition that will bring it better because we can control the price level, and rather than worrying about inflation and so on. So you've got two versions of a very simple story. We want jobs and growth, and then through that you can get prosperity. But post-2008, things seem to fall apart. It seemed to be the end of that story. And we're not sure what the new story is. And I think, to me, that's part of the interest in things like Cradle to Cradle, Blue Economy, and so on, circular economy, because it's hinting at, it's part of, it's not the whole thing, but it's hinting at a set of different sorts of perspectives about what the new story will be. And I think there is a strong emotional element in some people's interest in the circular economy, because it seems to promise, or at least give a direction for a form of thinking which is much more contextualized, much more reflecting contemporary science, the science of nonlinear and feedback-rich systems. And it's coming together with, it's the crisis plus the opportunity. And when it comes to learning, that would also mean to say that we're not going to take learning as a delivery from UPS, sign here. It's not content with a bit of process and we assume the context. Now it's flipped the other way around, I think, is we're really interested in what the context is, what the meaning is. We'll work on the process because we're not sure how it's going to be done, and then we'll draw in the content as we need. The content was never the problem, in my view. What was more important was what sort of context are we working in. Somebody said to me yesterday, when you say there's a business case for something, why don't we just say there's a case for something? What's special about saying it's the business case? Because if you reflect on that, that's a way of saying, this is how you have to think about this. And I think we're beginning to say, no, I think we could make a case for this, which would probably include business, but not just a business case. So I think there's some of this, for me, this sense of the appropriate time and the appropriate place and the appropriate tensions in the economy, leading to a fortuitous set of circumstances.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ken. I'm going to throw it open to the audience. We've got a question. Go ahead.
To a certain extent, a couple of you have talked about this being part of your journey and discovering this and becoming excited about this. To what extent do you think circular economy challenges us to become different kinds of learners and different kinds of teachers?
Can I pick
go
up?
for it.
I wanted to pick up that and my reactions to some of the things that were said here about certainly when we receive students, so say into their first year of undergraduate education, is to think about the journey that they've been on and the education system, the bigger system that they're part of. Because there's very much a process of unlearning. I mean, Ken Robinson talks about the answer being at the back of the book and this kind of whole industrial process of learning. But how do we awaken them to actually want to take a risk in that curiosity? And I think that's part of what we're doing as teachers in that is to almost create the psychological safety in which taking that risk is absolutely fine when they've emerged from a system where there's a consequence to that risk, because it's been about knowing the answer. And we're now throwing it all up in the air for them and saying, hey, it's not about the answer, it's about the thinking process. So I think understanding that bigger system and being part of challenging that is key.
Well, I totally agree. I think adding to your point, back to your question, I think it helps you to be disruptive in your thinking, the good disruptive that has been celebrated in this festival as well. So, meaning you have to be really engaging with other disciplines. So I've been trained as an applied economist. It's like military service to a certain extent. And so you have to educate yourself to go back to the obvious to a certain extent and start engaging with colleagues in a continuous learning type of approach. So it's disruptive because it goes over the boundaries of the actual disciplinary approach to learning. So there are new disciplines coming. That's my hope. So back to what Ken was saying, hopefully we're going to celebrate that different economics in a couple of decades from now. I think economists will like me after this statement. my career will be shining.
Polished to perfection, won't it?
Right.
I just wanted to add something in there about utopias, actually, because one or two economists have said, well, the economics we tend to teach at the moment, when you think about it, is a sort of utopia. It says something about how humans behave, how they behave, how they make decisions, the role of rationality rather than more irrational or group-influenced behavior. And it's almost a utopia because it says if you fit the economy design like this, everything will be well. It's almost a sort of, this is the way to heaven, that if you fit. Now, because it isn't really working, people have begun to say, well, lots of the assumptions in that sort of economy don't really work too well. And maybe our diversity of thinking, this is the argument for a more pluralistic economic approach, a diversity of thinking is exactly what you need in an era of turbulence. Because diversity gives strength, they say, to many complex adaptive systems, because it allows both resilience and creativity. And if we're in a period of turbulence, it would be exactly the best thing to do as a learner to be able to reflect a diverse set of opinions, informed opinions, models. And that's there's no wonder that student groups around the world have been developing, or protesting and then developing, a desire to see a more pluralistic range of economic models and ideas being shared. Because why would you stick with one which has seemed to have run out of steam in many ways? So.
Peter, in your experience of teaching those students,
well, it's a good question, and it gets right to the nub of the matter, really. So even before I talk about students, I'll talk about another personal reflection. So many of you will have children. I've got 4, still have them. And so eldest is 26, the youngest is just in the final year of A-level. So I've seen them go through primary, middle, secondary, into universities. And my heart sinks a lot of the time. And I don't blame teachers, I don't blame lecturers, but it's a system that's been created around measurement and assessment to measure quite narrow sort of metrics of performance and notional intelligence. So the over-testing at SATs is a real killer, and I think that there's some great content in curriculum in our schools, but they've squeezed the life out of curriculum and learning. And I see my kids, being taught to the test, learning to the test, learning to some sort of possible job down the line. If you work hard, you'll be successful. There's messages that pour in. I think I tried that once with my kids, and never again. Sort of say, just get on and do what you want. So, and in higher education, we're structured around modularisation, around assessment, methods that have a place, but that it's to me it's become quite constraining. So the challenge for as an academic lecturer, educator is what wiggle room have you got for innovating and doing things differently. So in the circular economy we talk about innovation. We're having to innovate, for teaching, learning, education around the circular economy. So the big challenge is to introduce the notion of systems thinking. So if the circular economy is about systems, and when do you know that you're a systems thinker? How do you know that? How can you teach systems thinker? If someone isn't a systems thinker, what do you do? So that's been the biggest challenge, the most interesting part of running an MBA on the circular economy, running executive education, running short courses, about retaining and maintaining that idea of shifting the way we think. Because the circular economy is about a different worldview, a new worldview, a bit of a paradigm shift. So how do you do that if you use the tools, methods and language of the old system?
That's really interesting, because we recently did a little pilot here with Adam 2 weeks ago called Generation Space, that some of the students participated, playing with a different narrative of building a spaceship and how to build a new society that would last for 1,000 years. And it was just tested, say, break all the rules and just walk in for a full day to say, yeah, there's no purpose, just you have to make materials last in the spaceship, and complete creativity with no rules. And you could tell the first 10 minutes there was a little bit of a, but then, it was an incredible, we worked with IDEA and IKEA, and it really, as an alumni of the MBA program, observing how this year it was tested, it really showed you that left a lot of insights, that as a lecturer, that this was being put into a table with, this is a dynamic system. And so I think a lot of what I'm picking up on is from this wiggle room has to have this dynamic.
Making fun of me, you were talking about improvisation theatre earlier before we went on air. And how can you do that? But if you're in a lecture room, a bank lecture room of 300 students, maybe you could introduce improvisational theatre into that setting. But it is something about what can you do, and it's great, and it's brilliant when you get the opportunity and you can do it. It's absolutely fantastic energy that's created, as opposed to a lot of the time the tyranny of assessment. The tyranny of the bank lecture theatre. I mean, if anything's going to kill learning, it's got to be that.
Jackie, I want to pick up there because I'm interested. We're obviously talking about higher education here, and there's more wiggle room depending on where you sit and higher education. But you've also worked in schools, and I wonder, it seems to me that the learning journey, we need to tackle this across the learning journey, and we sort of need to, I suppose, inform all of the learning journeys, and that's also something I think for all of us, we all admit that the circular economy has been a learning journey for us. Inside formal and informal settings.
I think it goes back to this whole question of why and purpose. So I did some work in a school ages 3 through 18 looking at a peace pedagogy. So looking at what does it take to create this whole idea of moral imagination. What is it to be able to take a multiple perspective, look across a system for children to kind of think beyond their classroom, beyond their school, into their societies, and how we use the context of learning to actually to pursue questions, and then how we can pair with other schools in other parts of the world to see that those questions are different depending upon the context that you're in. And all of this is, and somebody used the term utopia, and all this is utopia until we get a political system that frees our teachers up to be able to create those imaginative ways of learning and being. I do get a sense, when I was working in the school, I celebrated how much freedom I had as a university lecturer. Because I set my learning objectives, I set my assignments, I can go to certain places with the students, but when that curriculum is set nationally and your whole career is measured and benchmarked against student attainment of that curriculum, it's a very different picture. But I think it takes courage and it takes again, go back to that word of risk, but what's that education there to do, and how are we preparing those children for each stage of that journey and ultimately the world that they're going to be in? And I think the wider system is part of what we should be thinking about.
Ken, you've said before that, you know, sometimes those big structures of or systems and bureaucracies, one way is to go round them. So we've seen that with online education, and that there's a lot of material online now that young people are picking up on. They're going on their own journeys. They're exploring it. The DIF will be one of those platforms. But how is it necessary to go back and embed into the school system, or how do we take a lot of this stuff and accelerate it?
Yeah, John Kenneth Galbraith, an economist from quite a while ago now, he said that every revolution is the kicking in of a rotten door. You can't just go and kick in any door you might like, because it probably won't give way. And so this is, and I've seen in some innovation work, there's 3 horizons, sort of. I don't know if you've seen that. Horizon 1 is a current system, and it falls off quite a bit. And then a disruptive innovation comes along, let's call it aspects of the circular economy. And the first thing that happens is it gets to pick up, and it gets used in a way to, we can continue the system we've got. But some people are using that innovation to say, hang on, you know, there's little pockets of activity, can we shift it? Can we design something else? But almost like the way in which, say, renewables, and I think they really have taken off now, I don't think anybody's arguing about that. It takes a real while to get experience and knowledge about what you want to achieve or where you want to go. But it only really gets going when the other side gets weak, if you like. Not the other side, but you know what I mean, the current situation weakens. Same as happened with the fossil fuels. You might think, oh no, they're really still, you know, they run everything. But the rate of change of, say, installation of solar, the way we can run devolved grids, you know, the promising news around battery storage, it's coming together. You know, with people like Tesla and the rest of Tesla Motors and the rest of it, you can see suddenly it takes off. And if people who are used to looking at, say, the way even mundane items like washing machines, they bumbled along for a while and then it really took off. But there has to be an opportunity in the bigger system to let it through. If the bigger system is really strong. Now, take schooling, which is an education which you're coming back to. Almost all of our system is designed with the idea that there are going to be jobs out there, and there's going to be worthwhile jobs, and those jobs are going to last a while, or you can get retrained or whatever. But that's almost like that industrial sort of notion. It's a throughput system, and you need to measure it, and it's got performance targets and all the rest of it. But asking that basic, well, what are we doing this for? Because there are other jobs aren't out there. You know, there's lots of arguments saying, particularly in America, that the education system at HE levels is beginning to look like a Ponzi scheme, where you get people in at the base, keep pushing them through and telling them it'll be all right because there are other people coming through and we'll all do really well and we'll get our salaries and you'll get a job. But the burden of debt for students, particularly in America, I was thinking, the same here, means that increasingly we're getting very well-educated taxi drivers. And even in Britain, there was a survey I read from, I think it was The Independent, said that something like 40% of graduates are doing jobs that don't require their graduate skills. So why are we just pushing it through in that way? At some stage, it'll be pretty obvious that we need to break the link between work and wages, and when that happens, we'll be breaking the link between education as a conveyor belt and what comes at the, what it's for. And a lot of that will be, and as it's happened now, people will learn themselves. They become more autodidactic, if you like, but they will use networks and groups to help their learning process. They won't take it as, I need these people to legitimize that I have learned something. And I think that's quite exciting in a way. We don't know how it will reorientate. It might be, there's just this elite group of universities. I said, smiling at the audience. It's the elite group, and there'll be a few in the middle, but some more service-type universities at a local level. We don't know how it's going to change, but the monolith of an education system that is universal, pushes people through, by its own admission, it's pointed towards jobs and growth. All of those things are breaking down. So when the system gets weaker, the other opportunities might well grow. And if they don't, you've got a real question about, well, what are you doing it for?
So what are the jobs, you mentioned, we're assuming that there's jobs out in the market. What are the jobs we're assuming that the circular economy can provide to these students?
They're not necessarily going to provide jobs for them. That's not the way it might work in the future if we're quite radical. What they might have is a set of approaches to problems, approaches to working together, approaches to being enterprising, cooperative. They'll have a bunch of skills because they're more systems orientated. They'll be much more prone to make their own arrangements collectively and otherwise. Yeah. But I don't think, unless you have a very quite restrictive view of what a circular economy would be about, it wouldn't be just the new replacement for the existing managers. There'd be something often a bit more than that, because they're seeing the world differently.
Peter, what Ken's saying is maybe...
Yeah, you perhaps help me there.
No, but what you're saying...
What am I saying?
Well, I think it might be difficult for we're obviously at the University of Exeter, and it might be quite a difficult pill to swallow if we look at what we're doing, and if that's going to be a rotten door that gets kicked down.
No, I didn't say that.
I know you did. But I would like to put it to Peter and say, Peter, you're obviously, you've been in higher education for much of your professional life, and you're embarking on, some large circular economy projects.
Yeah.
Are you unwittingly the undoing of the system? Are you on the, or do you see a slightly different story to Ken? Institutions like this play a central role to the next economy.
Well, I'm going to spring to the defence of universities. I don't know, if we're talking about different things here, aren't we, about the universities as sort of centres of ideas, corpus of knowledge, adding to knowledge. They are amazing places, absolutely amazing places. So I've only been here 4 weeks, by the way. And the people I've met have just been incredible, doing amazing stuff. And most universities have got really great people in them. So that's one thing. And but we've ended up, for various reasons, with a sector that's been increasingly marketised. Student fees, I know to my pain, with 3 kids at or through university, I know the debt levels. I'm not going to go into that debate unless forced. But the sort of the role, the question would be what is the role of the higher education in the global economy? So are they basically essentially there to feed into a particular system that we might call linear, or is our job to create citizens who have a range of perspectives, as Jackie said, and are able to manage and handle complexity both for themselves, but also the context in which they sort of find themselves. So yesterday I was at a workshop by one of the research councils, the Science and Engineering Research Councils, and this sort of captured this point, that I want to make, and it was about the future of funding of complexity science in the UK. Okay, mathematics, artificial intelligence, etc., etc. And there was a presentation of doing a summary of 10 years of research funding, science and engineering research funding, and complexity science. And the guy sort of put up a slide. He said, "I'm just going to walk you through what some of our postdocs have ended up doing, after they've finished at this university." I'm not going to name the universities. It wasn't this university. So university in the Midlands, begins with W. And he had about 40 people on there from a doctoral training programme. Brilliant minds, mathematicians, complexity. He said, Julian, he's working for Paddy Power. Simon, he's working for Paddy Power. And half of them had gone into the UK gambling industry. And didn't blink. And the guy next to me from St Andrews, who's head of computer science, he said 30 years ago, they'd have been working on a project to send people to the moon. And there was something in that about universities, and how we've been structured to chase our funding, to justify our existence, and we're faced with challenges about what type of education, what type of research we do, and the challenge is maintaining our sense of the public good, the social contract, the social purpose, but also the reality. It's a tough world out there when you graduate. I've seen my kids. My son did maths at that university.
I see the academics on the side shuffling in their seat.
That
just created a lot of...
That created a...
I think it's a very valid point. One of the key approach I'm trying to use when it comes to learning is, again, I'm back to the point of making a clear connection between why, how, and what questions. So if you start your learning journey with why questions, so you immediately engage with values, with the ethics of what you're doing. So it allows you to start a lecture on circular economy by reflecting on what Thomas More have done a few centuries ago, or thinking about slavery and think, few centuries ago, this was a concept, controversial, but abolishing that thing was difficult to imagine. From an economics point of view, we thought our economies couldn't survive the abolishment of slavery. So I start engaging with provocative questions, saying, what if we imagine a society where we abolish waste as a concept? Because that's one of the foundations of circular economy. And we think this is silly maybe today or impossible to do. Anyway, these kind of exercises can inform other questions that are also relevant for our kids, that are the how and what question, because you need to couple more abstract exercises with activities and day-to-day problems. That's how you start transferring knowledge and prepare them to engage with a quite challenging and dynamic world. So that would be my take.
I just want to come back on this in case I get landed as a person who doesn't really like universities or something. Which is certainly not the case. I pick up Peter's point. This is the most valuable part of it, is that sense of in looking at really interesting social questions and relevant ones. And it's a sense of purpose. But if we have a world which is just being reproduced in the pattern of the past, it's not going to be a quick route through to something more enlightened, for all the reasons that students will go, well, I can work at Paddy Power, I can do some algorithms for some very strange derivative product that's the latest thing. Whereas they would have previously thought, what's my contribution to this? Or, that I could really be proud of? Because I don't know if I could go home and say, hey, Dad, I'm working for Paddy Power now and we're trying to extract the most from gamblers online. Yeah, okay, have a nice day. Does that seem worth it? Oh, well, they pay well. Okay. But I think that is really part of the challenge. Is this Einstein said years ago, the theory determines what we observe. We've stopped worrying about the theory. Just get it done. It doesn't really matter as long as it works for us in a sort of almost apolitical way. And there's a tendency to look at, it's a bit of the tech boom actually, is to try and pretend we're beyond politics. We're just technocrats, we get stuff done. But what is the theory behind it? In other words, what is the meaning behind it? What does it mean?
Michelle?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on that actually, because I think we're talking about young learners, but actually I think the university engages with people of all ages, and I think one of the key problems that older people have when they're coming back to learning is actually being able to test their intellect beyond the railroad that they've had to follow for maybe sometimes many years, and to encourage them to expand their thinking. And one of the things that circular economy can do as a subject is to take off the blinkers and allow people to think broadly about what part do I play in this? What's my purpose? And you know, what's the situation like now, and how would we like it to be? And picking up on the idea of utopias, they're a very wonderful tool for helping people think more broadly about things. And I think as a university we need to think about how do we engage with those older learners and how do we pull them in, because increasingly they're going to be a bigger part of our market. So in terms of you know, economic expedience, it's worth thinking about how we engage with them. But also they have different needs. They have some needs that are the same and some needs that are different. And as I alluded to previously, I think technology now has given us an opportunity to engage with large numbers of those learners. And I think it's incumbent on us to think about how we do that and what we do to engage them, maybe on a global scale.
I'm just going to open it up to the floor, see if we've got another question from the floor. Has anyone got something burning to ask? Dan?
Well, this week in Britain we had the budget. I was just wondering whether that was a cause for optimism or utter gloom in terms of achieving the circular economy.
I'll tell you what it is, Dan. It's very disappointing from the framing point of view on that. I was listening to the BBC intro in the morning, and it said, "Oh, our public budget is this much, and we've got to try and, or you know, the idea is we have to reduce our deficit, but we might let it go up a little bit for now, as long as we get back on track and get rid of the deficit, and hopefully, in the end, pay off the debt." This is, you know, this is framing 101 gone horribly wrong or right, because people didn't leap to strangle the particular presenter or anything. They just go, "Oh, yeah, I agree with that." So we've got to be really careful about how we do this. But if we had other more pluralistic perspectives on this, including the notion that it's actually expenditure which leads to income, and the fact that governments are not like households, they don't have a budget in that sense. If they're in charge of their own currency, you know, they don't have that. That is not a real issue, because you've got a framing there which says governments are like households, they have to keep within that. No, governments are like banks. Governments are like banks, you can therefore treat it differently. So if you can't even get beyond the basic framing of how the economy is structured, you're not going to get more creative thoughts about how do we shift the economy, because it's almost like it's got to go and fit back in the box. And that's really, for me, 101 about these sorts of things. It doesn't matter in a way what was put in the budget. It was just being done, if you look at things from the modern monetary theory, back to front.
Does anyone else want to pick up on the budget question, or is it?
What budget?
I'll change it from the budget question, since we have an international audience in the panel. And at the universities, you know, and the question with the mocks online, what is the framing at a global level? Because we know these mocks, you know, reach all sorts of continents, and there is a different framing in circular economy when we look at different regions and how they perceive it. Have you come across any of that friction when you're designing these programs, aware that there is an international audience who will be having, obviously not a budget question, they'll have different realities?
Yes, of course. And one needs to be mindful of that. But I think that tension is quite good. And that's part of the learning. And the beauty of having online programs that are global is that you have just that. You have a global studentship, if you like, and therefore you have these different perspectives coming in, and that makes the learning richer.
But it's interesting, isn't it, that almost all of the discussion about the economy still fits within a sort of pattern that's so global and accepted that it's very hard to have a different sort of conversation about resources, no matter where you're from or where you want to start from.
It can be.
I think it is.
Yes, yeah.
Stefano?
Yeah. Is it because I'm Italian and I have to represent somewhere?
You have to represent somewhere else.
The non-British. I do think it's a call for all of us to put culture and cultures into the discussion and debate around circular economy or circular economies, plural. Meaning, I think we haven't done enough to explore the different dimensions of this cultural geographical diversity. I have still a hard time to translate some of our thinking back maybe to my country or my own culture. It's just a matter of exercising language sometimes and how we frame. I think framing is also very important. So if we do more, we will learn more, and I'm sure we're going to have more exciting circular economies in the near future.
We used to make some awful blunders in the beginning.
Right.
And I particularly remember Peter, sorry Peter, saying he had to finish now because he wanted to go and have his tea, and he was talking to a global audience. And the Chinese were sitting up at 3 a.m. or something to listen to the programme.
I do remember
yeah.
that. Thank you for
I
reminding me
him.
on air in a recorded session. I mean, the great thing about online is you can bring students in from all over the world, and I know the MBA here at Exeter, you've got a fantastic international student group. Probably the same thing is that you get multiple perspectives, and as an educator, you learn as much as you try to give out, because you are learning things that you couldn't possibly know. Yeah. So we had students on the MBA that we were running from every part of the world, every industry sector, different professional backgrounds, and something came up that was new and interesting all the time, and they would say, "Hey Peter, do you want to hear about blah 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 blah?" And I'd say, "Great," we'd just throw it all into the mix. And the other thing about, you're absolutely right, these different perspectives. So what does the circular economy mean in the context of developing countries? Which way is it going to go? What does it mean for mineral resource-rich countries in Africa? Positive, negative, either way. But what you can do on an extended course is introduce, concepts about global trade agreements, the way they're structured, the implications for that, for if you start to change that in particular ways. And with Ken, sort of what we always say at the start of the programme is we don't know whether this content is right. It's emerging. Mm-hmm. We refer to it as a heuristic. Ken uses the phrase for 16th century world map, and that's what we tell the students. This is not a fixed body of knowledge. There is no textbook. We're making it up as we go along. Okay.
And here be dragons.
And here be dragons. Yeah. We're sort of not expert, but we know a bit more perhaps than most people. Therefore, you have to adopt that question that came in about what does it mean for it to be a teacher and a lecturer. You have to adopt a persona of humility, more than a persona, but an authentic position of humility that we don't know the answers. We have to structure it. We have to assess it, because that's what the requirement is for a certification and award. But within that, it's about saying, look, we're going to co-create. We're going to co-create and change the course as we go along. And we're going to feed your thinking and your assessment back into the course. And that should be the starting principle of a complex adaptive system.
Jackie, I want to turn to you, because there's a couple of things that's occurring here. One, you'll sort of, I think, openly admit that your early days on the circular economy journey, and one of the reasons you're on this panel is your knowledge in being an educator. But you also, I think, you've obviously looked at some of the DIF, you've seen what's being presented, and it is coming from all over the world. And what strikes me when I look at particularly the playlist, but even going into people who've put their hand up to put content on the DIF, is that it is global, and there is a hunger for it globally, which sort of maybe gives people a bit of more confidence that this is actually an idea worth getting on board with. Mm-hmm. But from your point of view, it's obviously the access point, and then putting it across to your students.
Yeah, a couple of things. So meeting Ken and you coming on board and getting pioneer status for us is fabulous, and listening to these ideas that challenge models of the economy and think about the flow of money, data banking, and all of these things has been great. But the systems thinking part has been in my life for quite a while. And you raised an interesting point earlier about how do we teach systems thinking. Well, I think we don't teach it, we engage in it, but once you're in it, you can never come out of it, because I think you see the world differently, and I think that's quite interesting. And I think part of that for me is how do we make some of that learning immersive? How do we get to the human in terms of the student and say, well, what does that mean for you? And in the past, when I've taught ethics, my starting point is always to connect the student to an ethical challenge that they personally have been through, and then to explore the values that played out in their decision making. And again, you know, John Dewey talks about maturity, but where you are on that journey of maturity is to, which is my thought, which is my family's thought, which is my society's thought. And so, you know, you're beginning to come to terms with, well, what am I actually about? What are my strengths and how do they add value? What are my values and how do they shape my behaviours and my beliefs? And I think some of that is quite fascinating. So we have to hold the space for dialogue, and in that we have to be comfortable with not knowing, which is again your point, and that really struck me from what you were saying, is if we can be comfortable with not knowing and we can show our vulnerabilities in that space, then I think now we shift to an authentic relationship between learner and host, or learner and facilitator, that we can explore together. We can genuinely explore together.
Ken, how important is it to, I mean, that sense of unknowing and not know, you know, being comfortable with that, but also you mentioned framing before. I think we've got a question online that leads to that.
Yeah, we have a question from online. It says, how far does this reframing of education, as mentioned by Peter, need to go back down the levels of teaching in schools? So
I get the sense that from some of that conversation we've got maybe a way of engaging with education that's quite open and takes into systems thinking, but then there's also this conversation that we've got a story that seems to have run its course. So how do we balance that in education or in our learning journeys?
I don't think things happen by deliberately trying to balance it. What happens is a new story comes along which does the job, or, you know, the things around it. It's the Buckminster Fuller thing. You don't try and fight against the old system. You design one that does the whole thing a lot better. Now, if through contemporary science and pluralistic economics, through innovations in education and so on, we're beginning to co-create, to use Jackie's word, a different way of approaching educational questions, that's all to the good. When it crystallizes, I think it will take over, but we don't know what that future story is yet. And that's why it's really exciting. This is also almost like my summing up bit. It's really exciting to be involved in exploring the potential for change, but doing it on the basis of not, oh my God, what are we going to do, is that contemporary science is pointing us towards thinking in a particular way, and that extends right through economics, psychology, whatever you want, you know, do the whole list. And that this is a real opportunity for people to be educated or participate in education. It's absolutely a participation thing. And help them make informed decisions. And somebody once said that education is the process of learning how the world really works. And that's emancipatory in itself. The closer you get to, you know, it's always limited, but the closer you get to feeling, yeah, I think I know how this works. That's a reward in itself, because from that basis people can say, I think I know how it works, and now I'm going to do this that matters to me. What we have to say is, let's not try and fix up the old system. We might have to live with it, and with that, we have to live with it, but we can't leave it at that. And that's the excitement of co-creating and participating.
We have another question again around the education. And is it time for the Steiner and Montessori schools to have their curriculum scaled so as to cultivate the systems thinkers and circular economic designers of future generations? So I think that's what you were just...
Yeah, can I speak to that for a second? I think I would really love to learn by asking those teachers that are leaving their profession why they're leaving. What did they hope for and what did they find? And how could we keep them engaged? Because I think there's learning the system needs to do from those that are the educators about what they're experiencing in that profession right now. Because, you know, I can't think of any teacher at whatever level, from kindergarten right through, that doesn't want the very best for that student, that is not about the whole learning and curiosity and play. And I think Steiner, Montessori, there are many, many models. They're all based on certain philosophies, and you know, there's a plurality. I can't even say the word.
Lots of them.
There's multiple. There's multiple ways of looking at that. But what is it that we want? What's human about the learning process, and how are we enabling that? And
I think maybe tackling this question, there is a central point that connects this question to what we are discussing, is this sense of citizenship that you have to embrace when you start educating or learning through the circular economy. Because of the content of the circular economy that tackles and really challenge the process of how we do things, you have to change the way you do learning and you engage with learning. If you don't do that, you can't offer an authentic approach to learning. So I think, you know, there are indeed plural pedagogic approaches, but I think a common ground is this sense of citizenship and communities, I would say, that you need to think about when you start.
I love how you keep bringing up the cultural part in the community. We have someone in the audience who's trying to simplify it in the sense of, is circular economy teaching simply multidisciplinary teaching? You know, there's just aspects that we keep picking up on here, from the person as an individual, the culture and community, and then this concept of interdisciplinary that needs to be, you know, re-embedded into much more at an academic level. But yeah, I think there's a little bit of everything in there.
If systems are about connections and consequences, which I think they principally are, well, you know, non-linear systems are full of connections and consequences which are not determined and are not predictable, but there's still pattern in there, it's not chaos. It's inevitable that you're going to be asking different questions about what knowledge is relevant to this learning. The very concept of a discipline, there's always, it's been a convenient way of dealing with content, but I suppose being more aware of systems thinking, being more open to bringing in insights from other areas, it's a long-term, been happening for decades, this sort of discussion. But it's coming more to the fore because we're able to demonstrate that systems are interdependent, that consequences spin off. We can model it even very nicely through the computer now. And digital, one of the big things is we can show the fractals and the bifurcation point and the interconnectedness and the seventh degree of change in systems. So we no longer quite puzzled. So I think that's all to the good. But we're not going to make a mess out of it. There are still rules to this way of learning. There are patterns. There are ways of approaching. It's not free for all.
I want to take a question from the floor. Becky.
Yeah. Question for the panel is, in this new learning environment then, how are the traditional pillars of theory and practice changed by circular economy?
Can I pick up, not on that, but just on, before, sorry about that, but before
I'm going to do
on
your
to
question, Mickey.
That's a hard one.
Mickey, we'll come to yours in a second, but I mean, just picking up on that, one of the things, we had a very interesting and exciting conversation today about interdisciplinary teaching and learning. And I think, you know, universities, like all establishments, have a tendency to silo thinking and silo activity because, you know, boxing and coxing, it makes much more sense to have a department that goes like this and is linear. And so we have lots of pillars of departments. And actually, the circular economy, you could teach it vertically. Actually, you really need to teach it interdisciplinary. And that's one of the changes I think that we're going to have to look at, is how do we teach in an interdisciplinary manner. So it doesn't quite answer your question, Mickey, but I just picking up on really what Ken said there. I think that's a serious change for us, really, is how do we work more across disciplines, how do we connect more across universities. Universities are big, big organisations, often with many thousands of staff, you know, and how do we get to know
I guess that's replicated in business and big organisations.
Yeah. How can we work in more of a network manner?
You know, it's been 20th century model to have verticals, and it's worked. It worked in the 20th century. It doesn't seem to be working so well now.
But picking up on, you know, what Jim Banius would say, we need to put, you know, the engineer with the chemist, you know, with the environmental expert, with the botanist or whatever. And what do we get there? We get something entirely different. And yet we have a tendency not to do that. And we're still doing that in education. Sorry,
I want to come back to Mickey's question.
yes,
Peter, would you like to pick up on?
What was the question? About theory and
theory
practice.
And practice pillars.
Yeah, okay. Okay, good. It's a good question, Mickey, because it goes back to what I was saying before about the role of universities in this corpus of knowledge. You know, and there is a body of knowledge in mathematics, in physics and chemistry, that if you want to become a chemist in some sort of sense, you have to know about, and this idea of thresholds of knowledge. At what point are you a chemist or an economist? And because there is so much knowledge and stuff out there, you know, that's why we tend to be siloed, and you get overcrowded curricula and drives out cross-disciplinarity. But on a particular point then about there's something like economics and theory. That was going back to something Ken said about, you know, the theory determines what you see. Okay.
Yeah, same thing.
So what I think the way into it is, and it's not really to do with the circular economy, it's about education in general, is that as part of the education process we need to understand that point. Students are very rarely offered that conversation that there are multiple theories in economics. There are about 8, 9 theories which ask different questions, and from their theoretical perspective and the worldview end up arriving at different answers, possibly to the same question or asking different questions. So there's a great book, The Penguin Reader on Economics by
Arjun Chang.
Arjun Chang. Okay, which makes this point brilliantly, saying economics is a really simple subject made difficult by economists. Okay, and explains it. And if you want a good, you know, introduction to economics, then that's the book I'd recommend. So it goes through neoclassicism, you know, sort of Keynesianism, institutional theory, and Marxism. And I think that's the point. I think the circular economy is asking different sorts of questions about the world, and it's developing its own sort of theoretical notions, which means you might end up with different answers to long-standing problems, and often regarded as wicked problems or intractable. It's catching intractable problems. So that's what excited me when I first came about it, because I thought I've been asking these questions all my life. The theories that I've been using partially answer it, but it doesn't quite fit. It's like a pair of ill-fitting shoes. And the practices I see that follow from that theory are also like ill-fitting shoes, and something's not quite right. So it was this light bulb moment when I started to think about this way that Ken and the others had put this system together. I thought, yeah, that makes sense. And what we're doing now, and the role of the university, is to start to try and validate and create the evidence base and theorise the circular economy in ways that universities should. That's our role, and that's why I'm at Exeter, that's why Michelle's here, Stefano's here. That's what we're interested in, is developing theory and practice around the circular economy that then enables other academics to say, yeah, maybe there is something in it after all.
I want to change direction now. I want to go back to the themes of the DIF, and one of the themes this year was the age of automation. And I think there's a lot of, I think a lot of young people are aware of what's coming very quickly our way. But I wonder what the panel thinks about, you know, what does this mean for our collective learning going forward? This idea that we're going to be engaging with the algorithm more and more, where do you see it fitting in with possibly the circular economy, but also with our learning journey? Jackie,
I'll just make a quick comment that when I was watching those sessions, that, you know, I was delighted to hear and to understand is that the automation, the algorithms are there to free up the human potential. That actually, what is it that can be passed over to an algorithm that helps us to deal with the mass part of the current university structure, which is big lectures, as you spoke about earlier, big piles of marking, And actually, what is it then that the human part that the teacher brings, the sense making, the journeying, the supporting, that you're freed up to do, that part of you that is the essence of your profession and what's about being a good teacher is. So I feel that's really exciting. And actually, the book that you just spoke about was a fantastic RSA Animate, which actually depicts and captures the whole thing. So now we can have multiple layers of learning, and we can say to a student, yeah, you need to do some reading, but go and have a look at this. So you've kind of got many aspects to it.
Stefan, yeah, going to turn to you, because I'm also interested.
I like to
about
be very explicit, maybe overstating here. So when it comes to these big topics, like the age of automation, I wouldn't like to tackle those topics in terms of, you know, how many jobs we are going to create or lose, the job creation loss type of framing, which is relevant maybe to do to a certain extent. I think it offers again an opportunity to imagine the society of the future. So if we don't reflect on those type of big changes like automation, in terms of imaginary exercises, is this a society that that is going to look more liberated or less liberated by these processes? How is the humans that we're going to imagine engaging with more automation? And I think we haven't done that enough. We tend to go to the framing of job creation type of thing. Ken, what do you think?
I was thinking more human than human. It was a line from Blade Runner,
right?
Which is the design of the replicants to be more human than human is our motto.
Yeah, if you reflect on that, the imagination we do have on this type of civilizations is always hostile. It's a place where we have more elites and slaveries than ever before. It's our old societies where we've lost track of culture again. We have lost track of fundamental rights even.
But it could be very liberating, we know this.
Exactly.
But you have to break the link between work and wages.
Right.
For instance. Because if you have automation, AI, and in fact already the global economy overproduces chronically, there's not a problem of production in the world. There's a problem of demand perhaps, and there's a problem of how people make a living. Well, why not break that? In other words, you know, people talked for a little while about, well, it's been back to the 18th century, a sort of universal basic income, so that people can spend money and meet their basic needs and do creative things and be human, because all the other horrible stuff gets done. I think that's what's exciting for me about it. I'm not worried about automation and AI if we have recognized the role of the human in the system and not tried to say, well, you'll really have to compete to get a job in this sort of world, and how do we match the AI with your skills? No, I want those things to be done to make my life, my family, if I had one, the future generations, I want it to be a lot easier. Why not? Because I know an academic at Imperial College who said we can probably get by with about 500,000 productive people in Britain. That was his challenge. He works in design, you know, in actually making things. And I like the idea of that, but it won't work if you're saying, oh, and you'll have to accept wages about this big, and part-time work and gig work, they'll send you a text. This is like the docs era, you know, the docs labour scheme. Now people get a text when to show up and do some work. And we're supposed to be grateful for that. We've got to take that away from the equation. And that is a systems thinking thing. You know, we're talking about AI automation, but we're not really willing to connect that with notions of where does expenditure come from, where does the income come from to be able to participate in a society like that. Because we're just assuming the old framing, work and wages. We're assuming capital versus labour. I think we're moving well beyond that if we want.
I think we've always had a fear, haven't we, of the unknown. You know, if you go back in history and you think about the Luddites and things like that, where people smashed the machines because they were fearful of what happened next. And I think part of the problem is that we do need some new tools, as you alluded to there, new economic tools, you know, new fiscal tools, all sorts of new tools. And we can't, unless we're very innovative and creative in our thinking, for the majority we can't see what it's going to look like. And so it's back to the stories that Ken was talking about, and creating the stories that allow people to see a new narrative and see a new way of thinking about things. And once we start to do that, then we can look at the problem, and it's not intractable.
Didn't John Muir say that you can't just change one thing? You know, famous environmentalist, conservationist. You can't just change one thing. And yet so often the discussion is siloed.
Yeah.
As though, what about AI and automation? What does that mean? But we're not going to assume we might change other things at the same time.
Can I just see if there's a question in the audience? Yes.
Technology is often framed as the solution to all of our problems and also the cause of all of our problems, and often by people that are not involved in creating that technology. And as Ken mentioned earlier, quite often technology is just producing solutions. Where are the people that are in technology, who are quite often not in the education system but in the private sector? Where are they in the conversation around circular economy?
Where are they? Can I answer that one?
Yeah.
Go with that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where are they in the conversation about circular economy? In the age of IT and automation, there is a great opportunity to disintermediate the world, you know, so that you don't have to bother with the middle person. You can go direct. And yet there's an equal possibility of huge overproduction in the world. So the IT people might be getting busy to say, well, how do we use this enormous pile of data that we're able to harvest? The data is the new resource to enable us to make sure we could still create enough scarcity in order to be able to get a price. In other words, if we control the platform, which allows us people to communicate with whatever we're doing, you know, name your favorite big tech company, they're mining data for the benefit of the owners of the platform, quite right, if you follow that sort of venture capital model. Even so, some of them don't make any money yet. You know, it's growth before profit. But IT in this might be about ensuring that we are getting great services, but there's still quite a lot of revenue that's going to go back to the owners of the platform. Because there's not going to be any money, there is hardly now in manufacturing. That doesn't get you money. You know, Rolls-Royce don't make their money from selling the engine, they get it from running this fantastic maintenance program on top of it. And where does, you know, the Amazon web server, is it web server? AWS, Amazon
Web Services, yeah.
Web Services, that's it. They create about 30% that creates 30% of the profit that Amazon makes. In other words, tech people are finding a fantastic role in making sure that the new resource can be mined effectively for people who are
Ken,
putting up the money.
What if you are a circular economy, you know, enthusiast, and you're in the tech industry? What is it? Where are
You've
the?
just done great things. You've done great things because you don't need so much stuff. Everything is a service. You're getting access to things as you like, and you're also being able to make a profit from it. So the resource implications might be really good, because you get from an era of stuff post World War II to an era of no stuff in terms of durables. Design it well, make it your extended product life, access over ownership. IT's at the heart of all of this change. But I was just teasing you with that other connection with is who's going to get benefit out of this and how?
Yep.
I don't know if that helps.
Just to come back, just an example. For example, there's a lot of talk around blockchain and sort of distributed trust through kind of technology, but it's running incredibly. You know, there's an enormous amount of power overhead.
Yeah, like the size of Nigeria. Nigeria's
to run all these computers and call them, and it's, you know, using resources. I wonder if there's a kind of where just because we can build technology, should we be building technology in these solutions for profit or for, you know, for where's the good?
Where's the good in that?
In that,
we know the system generally works. Technology drives economics, and economics drives the politics. That's unfortunately, or fortunately, how it works. And so I'm actually quite optimistic about this, because the very technology that's helped create a way of funneling wealth in return for data mining is also creating tools which are being more and more devolved and more shared. This is that argument about be careful what you ask for, because it looks like you're creating a monopoly opportunity. Network capitalists, some people call them, don't they? But you're also creating millions of people who can use these tools as they get cheaper to do things in different ways in a more devolved economy. So I see there's a huge tension between the two, but actually you can use these tools in a very positive way, in a value-sharing way. You know, like the tension between network capitalists and platform cooperatives, for instance. There's a huge underbelly of interesting ideas happening at other levels, which are non-profit, cooperative, locally organised, you know.
Stefano, I want to bring you in there.
Yeah, I was reflecting on a very good question. I think if we manage to couple, to relate technology with what's happening in society, particularly in terms of how we can possibly imagine new ways of managing the commons, common resources. Because one of the issues behind the so-called tragedy of those commons has been this really difficult and costly way of controlling and managing information, property rights around potentially common resources. So the optimism I do have when it comes to coupling technology and structural societal issues is enabling all kinds of new social devices, contracts, communities, platforms that might be able in a less costly way to manage those resources.
Not to mention the revival of democracy, in a sense, because you can make decision-making in a more devolved way more frequently for your, for your community's purposes.
Right.
It's not limited that once in a 5-year tick-a-box thing.
It's a more transformational type of process.
Yeah, I mean, we're in a business school today, and I see it as one of the roles of the business school, not here, but any business school, is to embrace science and technology, the so-called fourth industrial revolution, and bring that into the business school. And in relation to the circular economy, what's the role of the university? We need to be linking our research and education in ways that promote this story about the circular economy and the role of science and technology within the economy, and either towards a dystopian or utopian trajectories, whichever. And it can go in different trajectories. So to me, I'm a technical optimist. I prefer Google to Ask Jeeves, which is what I grew up on. Anybody remember Ask Jeeves? Yeah? Okay. So I think it's absolutely amazing what's going on in science and technology, synthetic biology, chemistry and what have you, the genome. It's just absolutely incredible. You know, we are in an age, the new renaissance. But as academics, as educators, we have responsibility for, as you said, sort of creating the space and bringing all this together in ways that we can work with students, with each other, with society, with grand societal challenges in ways that we tell a positive story. We look.
I think I've got another question from the audience. Can I just go to that, please?
I wanted to ask a question about this collective learning within the context of circular economy. I've lost count of the times I've heard people in my company say, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And but everyone talks about, I think almost everyone on the panel talks about context, framing, even once or twice. And I think if I understood Ken right, it said instead of starting with content and start with the framing and the values and then let content be derived from that. And Peter talking about how teaching to the exam sucks the life out of things. But the great thing about content is you can measure it. You can put reports and graphs and nice things. So within the context of circular economy and learning, how do you measure it? Whether it's working, whether it's improving.
I take that.
So I was talking to Mickey about this earlier on today, so I'd prime Mickey to ask a similar question. So I could give this very learned...
Obviously didn't give him enough money.
Giving this learned answer. But at a very practical level, so we're in a business school, the day-to-day reality of business, whether they're aiming towards circular economy or not, you're absolutely right that the role of metrics, indicators, your annual bonus, blah, 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 drives behaviour. Therefore, I think it's those are really important infrastructure that we've got to look at and address. So doing a bit of work with Mickey about what would be an appropriate portfolio or dashboard of indicators and metrics that reflected the circular economy.
So Peter, am I right here that we haven't actually got those tools at the moment? Are we putting our hands up and saying actually some of the circularity is immeasurable, or we're uncertain of what we're measuring?
Well, some of the system dynamics are very difficult to measure. What I am saying is that metrics and indicators need to come back to the starting principles of, you know, what do we mean by the circular economy, and you have to track it through to say, ultimately, somebody wants to measure progress against it, for, you know, rightly or wrongly. Therefore, we can't ignore that. So we're just doing a little piece of work, as I say, to say, well, what are those in different contexts? You know, what would turns people's attention to both the immediacy of the day-to-day, but also the wider system. So it's an interesting question, and I would agree with you. We do need measurement. We live in a world of measurement. As
we come to the end of the session, I'm conscious of time. So if you do want to answer some of that question, you probably get the opportunity in your sum up. So
I've really loved how we've covered in this session. We've started with the why, and I want to bring it back to you, Jackie. But we've really pulled at this from all levels, from the academic, from culture, from technology. I think we've done really good pivoting, you know, from how's the circular economy look from different points. But it's inevitable that we come back to the question of, you know, the human and the change that has to happen within each one of us, and the moments that have inspired you as lecturers to be on this path. Jackie, do you have any final remarks after having lived through the discussion, something that's really sparked for you?
The reflections will last for days, because I think there's so much in here, and so much speaks to the many conversations we have in lots of different contexts. There was a metaphor on one of the DIF films, and Ken can point me to which one it was, around the forest floor. And in fact, was it yours?
Yes. Might have been. It might have been me.
Yes, it was. Actually. Yeah. The forest floor, yes. and the notion of that ecosystem feeding many parts, and we don't have a tangible metric for how we measure human flourishing, but there is something about the well-being of the people in these systems, rather than the linear, yes, it could be ticked and against a box. So I look forward to the challenge that our professors are faced with in terms of how we tell that story and how we get the evidence base. But there's something beyond a metric that has to do with that flourishing and that forest floor that I think
yeah, very quickly, because we're running out of time.
I have a metaphor for that question. It's like, you know, asking the type of music you want to play on the Titanic. So to a certain extent it's relevant, but if you don't contextualize that question, you know.
I think that's a great place to leave our audience hanging with that one. I would really like to thank the Disruptive Innovation team that are based with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. They've supported us in getting this event up and running. I'd like to thank the Exeter Business School and obviously the MBA for hosting us. Our lively studio audience, thank you very much for attending, and for you online. It's been fantastic, and thank you for your questions. I'm going to in a minute hand over to Ken to give us just a final word of thought, so that to take us away. Before I do, I'd like to thank my co-host Delfina and our fantastic panel. Thank you very much. Ken, as always, it's been a great pleasure having you here with us, and I'll hand it over to you for the last word.
I hate these sort of little things, don't you? But I do really hate them, because so much has been said and I can't really gather it all together in some two or three sentences. So I'm going to use somebody who might sound authoritative, that we might take as a sign of what we're engaged in. I was in Oxford at a strategic materials conference a couple of weeks ago, and the guest lecturer was Lord Stern, you know, Nicholas Stern. And I was, you know, climate change and stuff, and I was going, yeah, okay, that's fine. And he suddenly starts to mention the circular economy. I thought, oh, hello, better pay attention, better make a note here. And he said, and I remember the quote quite clear, after saying you ought to go to the Isle of Wight and talk to the foundation, which I thought was really good, if you want to find out more. Which I thought, oh, great plug, we didn't even, you know, no incentives needed on that one. But what he said, what was interesting, which was the important bit, he says, the circular economy is intellectually fascinating and potentially of great value, which I thought was what I think we've been trying to suggest, we don't know what the answer is. And I think he's saying that when he says it's intellectually fascinating and potentially of great value. We're working this out. We're finding our way through the woods with this one. But there's something in it which suggests a future that is much more interesting. It might be a future where we're thriving, or it might be, I don't know what metaphor to use here. But I'd like to leave you with Nicholas Stern's thoughts, really, and just a great big thank you to everybody here and my colleagues and friends, I would say, on the panel for helping us take us further along that journey. Okay, so
thank you very much.
Thank you.